everyone. As a final topic for today's lecture, I want to begin to address a theme which will continue to be of importance for the rest of the course, namely the notion of rule ordering. So we've already seen fairly early on in the course instances in which phonemic analysis could help us to simplify an analysis by assuming that some rules could be crucially ordered. So by crucially ordered here, I mean that one rule has to be assumed to apply either before or after another rule in order to generate the correct forms. Now, there are cases in which you may need to write multiple rules, but they don't require any crucial ordering. So above, when we analyzed the Turkish data, there we had written 4 rules in total. We had these 3 neutralizing rules in addition to the vowel harmony rule, but the rules here, you can try this at home in the derivation given under point 7 here. You could try to apply the rules in any given order, and the results would be the same. What's more interesting are cases in which rules have the potential to interact. And in contrast to the cases involving phonemic analysis, the case involving Lango that I discussed in the lecture from week 2, and the analysis of phonemes in Squamish in the first homework assignment, there having rule ordering merely helped to simplify the rules a little bit. It wasn't essential for obtaining a correct analysis that could generate the data. There are other cases in which the data will require the rules to be written in a particular way, and generating the data will also require a correct ordering. And when we find that rules have to be crucially ordered, that arises because the rules have the potential to interact with one another in some particular way. And there are, in general, a couple of different, 3 or 4 different possibilities. We'll talk about 4 different terms for describing the interaction of rules. So in one instance, we have cases in which a rule creates the conditions for the application of another rule. There are also cases in which one rule destroys the conditions for the application of another rule. And then there are contrary to fact conditions. There are possibilities where one rule had the potential, it could have created or destroyed the conditions for the application of another, but because a rule applies after another rule, it doesn't have that effect of creating or destroying the conditions. And for some time in phonology, there is a set of specific terms that have existed for these types of so-called process interactions. There's a famous article by Paul Kitarski from 1968, which introduces a couple of these terms. And there's a nice recent article by Eric Bakovich, which talks about some of these interactions in the context of so-called opacity. Now, the first type, where one rule creates the conditions for the application of another rule, is called feeding. The case in which a rule destroys the conditions for the application of another rule is called bleeding. And the contrary to fact conditions, the cases in which a rule could have created the conditions or could have destroyed the conditions for the application of another rule, are called counterfeeding and counterbleeding, respectively. Recognizing these last types is a bit more complicated. Most people find it fairly intuitive to recognize feeding and bleeding relationships, but recognizing the counterbleeding and counterfeeding relationships is a bit more complicated. I'm going to follow Hayes here in referring to the 2 rules as A and B. Let's discuss this diagram from chapter 8 in Hayes' book briefly. So here we have the 2 possible orders, where we would say that our 2 options are either for rule A to precede rule B or to follow rule B. And we can look at the further question of whether rule B succeeds in applying or fails to apply. When rule A precedes B and B succeeds in applying, then we would say that A feeds B. So And more specifically, rule A creates the conditions that are needed for rule B to apply. If A, however, follows B and B still succeeds in applying, this means that rule A occurred too late in the derivation in order to remove a condition where B could have applied. And we say that A counterbleeds B. On the other hand, where A precedes B, rule A precedes rule B, but we see that B is not able to apply, this is because A must have removed a location where B had the potential to apply. And then similarly, if we know that A follows B, but B fails to apply, then this must be because rule A occurred too late in order to create the conditions for B to have applied. So in the remainder of the lecture here, I'm going to first illustrate these 4 types of rule interaction using some invented data, and then I'm going to introduce at the very end a type of diagram, a type of visualization called a Hasse diagram, which can be used for representing the relationships. I think since we have enough for this week, we will save the analysis of Brazilian Portuguese for the following lecture. So the invented data here is partly inspired by processes that are actually found in varieties of Arabic and in Japanese. We'll begin with feeding, which is usually the simplest to recognize. So again, we can say that rule A feeds rule B when rule A is ordered before rule B, and A creates new configurations, new conditions, or new sounds to which B is able to apply. So let's consider 2 processes. I'll call these processes epenthesis and sibilant palatalization. Our process of epenthesis states that a vowel E, a high front vowel E, is inserted between 2 consonants at the right edge of a word. The process of sibilant palatalization changes an underlying non-distributed sibilant to a distributed non-anterior sibilant, sh. So you can check those features on your feature chart. So comparing the sounds s and sh with one another, the sound s is plus anterior and minus distributed. The sound sh, on the other hand, is non-anterior, those palatoalveolar sounds, and plus distributed. And that palatalization occurs before the vowel E. So we can see here, when we compare the environment for the application of sibilant palatalization and the effect of the epenthesis rule, that there is potentially some relationship, because the sound E, that front high vowel, is involved in both cases. So let's look at a couple of forms, potentially, of a word meaning duck. Let's say that in its basic form, the form is mashit, with the sound sh and the vowel E in the final syllable, but in its plural form, there is a suffix a, and this word is masta. We can see then that the basic form, mashit, results from the application of epenthesis and palatalization together. So from the underlying form, mast, this would be a case where the suffix form provides us with the underlying representation. Epenthesis inserts the vowel E because underlyingly there are 2 consonants at the right edge of the word. So this creates the intermediate form, the middle form, so to say, masit. And now the environment for the application of sibilant palatalization is present. And so we obtain the form mashit. So originally, in the underlying representation, mast, the conditions for sibilant palatalization were not present. So in this invented language, sibilant palatalization would be a sort of allophonic rule, potentially, and under an S becomes sh when it happens to stand before an E. But there's no E in the underlying representation here. The E is added, the vowel E is added by the process of epenthesis, and only because epenthesis was able to apply here does palatalization have the opportunity to apply. In the suffixed form, masta, since a vowel is now at the right edge of the word, epenthesis doesn't apply, and then there is no vowel E following the S, which would create the conditions for palatalization. So in those forms, the ordering of epenthesis before palatalization created the conditions for palatalization, creating the form mashit. Let's move to the next possibility, bleeding. In a bleeding relationship, we say that rule A bleeds rule B when rule A occurs prior to rule B, and rule A removes configurations to which B could have otherwise applied. Let's keep the same rule of E epenthesis, which we used above, and add a process of voicing assimilation, as one would find it in, say, French or Russian, where an obstruent sound takes on the voicing values of a following obstruent sound. So this is a process of regressive voicing assimilation. The voicing of a following obstruent is applied to a preceding obstruent. So here, let's keep the same morphology with a plural suffix, ha, and we find two different forms of the word for goat. We have magit on the one hand, but in the plural, we have makta. So here we see two alternations. We have an alternation of the vowel E with nothing, just as we did in the paradigm of our word for duck above. But we also now have an alternation of voiced ga with voiceless ka. In this case, by assuming that the voiced sound, given these two rules, is underlying, we can derive the correct forms. In this case, by having epenthesis apply prior to voicing assimilation, epenthesis removes the conditions for the application of voicing assimilation. So here we have an underlying sequence ga, ta, at the right edge of the word. So an E is inserted, and now the result is that this voiced velar stop ga no longer immediately precedes a voiceless coronal stop ta. And so the underlying voiceless value remains the same. But in the plural form, because there is a suffix a there, the epenthesis rule does not have the opportunity to apply. It doesn't need to apply. And now voicing assimilation does apply, and the velar becomes voiceless. The velar adopts the voicing value of the following voiceless obstruent. If we were trying to solve this problem, if we were given this data and needed to explain this paradigm from the beginning, note that we would need to apply the same technique that we did in Tonkawa here. Neither of these forms reflects the stem, the underlying form of the stem on the surface. We need to both remove the vowel E, which is due to the epenthesis rule, and find the correct value of the voicing of the velar stop, which only is found if epenthesis has applied. Because if epenthesis applies, it can remove the conditions for voicing assimilation by breaking up that cluster of consonants. Now we can come to the two sometimes more confusing, sometimes more difficult types of rule ordering because they involve contrary to fact thinking. We'll discuss counterfeeding first and then look at an example of counterbleeding. Here we say that rule A counterfeeds rule B if rule A occurs after rule B. So this is different than bleeding and feeding, where we are saying that rule A applies before rule B. And if rule A occurs after rule B, and rule A has the potential to create new environments to which B could have applied, if A had applied before B. So this is a bit complicated, but hopefully by inverting the feeding order that we saw just above, we can see how this actually works. So in the feeding case, our E epenthesis rule created the conditions for the palatalization rule, but if we simply invert the order of these two rules, then we have a counterfeeding condition. So let's extend the inflection of our nouns and add another noun. So let's add a suffix e for the dative case in our invented language. And let's have a stem which ends in a in an anterior sibilant sa. So in this, the word meaning capybara, in the dative case, we find the palato-alveolar affricate sh, because in the dative case, it occurs before an e underlyingly. So this e is underlying, it's not created by palatalization. The result is that palatalization is able to apply. But in our paradigm of the word for duck, although on the surface we find an S occurring before a vowel E, now our form is masit. Remember, in the feeding ordering, the form of the basic word of the word meaning duck was mashit. In this case, epenthesis applies too late to allow for palatalization. Palatalization already tried to apply, but the form on which palatalization was trying to operate was must, so nothing is able to happen. Consequently, when epenthesis applies later, the S remains unchanged. It doesn't become sh. So to make this, to review this once more, in this case, we would say that epenthesis counterbleeds palatalization because, as we can see in the form masit, epenthesis creates an environment to which palatalization could have applied if epenthesis had applied prior to palatalization, which is what we saw in the feeding case above. The last case of counterbleeding is simply the opposite of bleeding. In such counterbleeding cases, Rule A is ordered after Rule B, and Rule A would have removed configurations to which Rule B can apply if A had applied first. So let's take the bleeding language with the rules of epenthesis and voicing assimilation, and I will add another rule to this language, which states that a vowel that has high pitch, we'll call this rule tone lowering, becomes low pitched in the last syllable of a word. So we can see in some paradigms here, in the nominative singular forms, there are no vowels with high pitch indicated with the acute accent above a vowel, but in some of the form, in some of these words, in the words for goat and turtle, when there is a suffix, here we'll assume that the accusative case has a suffix u, and in this dialect, we'll say that the dative case has the suffix a. The words for goat and turtle in these suffixed forms have a high tone. So let's consider, how can we derive the paradigm of goat in this dialect? So following the interaction above between epenthesis and voicing assimilation, we can recall that, let's assume the same underlying form, and let's assume that since we find this high tone in these suffix forms, that this high tone is underlying. So in the accusative, we would have underlying mag to with a high tone. We must need the same ordering of epenthesis and voicing assimilation as we had above. So voicing, and then we'll come back to considering where the tone lowering rule needs to be ordered. So if epenthesis doesn't apply here because there's a vowel at the end of the word, and voicing assimilation does apply, giving us maktu with a high tone. Here, we would find that epenthesis does apply, and just as above, epenthesis bleeds the application of voicing assimilation, but we need to do something further to ensure that this vowel, this a, doesn't have a high tone as it does. This means that the tone assimilation rule must apply prior to the epenthesis rule. So tone lowering must first make this underlying high pitch into a non-high pitch, because that is the vowel closest to the right edge of the word. We can see if we had the reverse ordering of epenthesis and tone lowering, that, let's take the same derivation and I will simply invert the ordering of epenthesis and tone lowering. If epenthesis applied first, tone lowering would not have the opportunity to apply. This would mean that epenthesis would, in this case, where the vowel remains high throughout the paradigm, epenthesis bleeds both tone lowering and voicing assimilation. Consequently, in the actually occurring fake invented forms that I've made, tone lowering counterbleeds epenthesis, or sorry, I should say epenthesis counterbleeds tone lowering. That is what we want to say. Epenthesis counterbleeds tone lowering because epenthesis could have bled, as we can see from this derivation. Epenthesis has the potential to bleed tone lowering by causing a vowel to which epenthesis could have applied to no longer be the vowel nearest to the right edge of the word. But because epenthesis applies too late, tone lowering is able to apply. So epenthesis doesn't, in this case, actually bleed tone lowering. And the result is that then there is an allomorphic alternation in the tone on the stem. Sometimes it's a non-high tone and sometimes it's a high tone. Okay, now that we've briefly illustrated all four types of rule ordering, I want to briefly show you a type of diagram that can be used for representing the ordering things. These so-called Hassa diagrams are commonly used in phonology, but they're not only used in phonological analysis, but also in other scientific fields where it's necessary to talk about the crucial ordering of relationships. These allow us to precisely show what we know and don't know about ordering relationships. So let's consider the language that has the bleeding and counterbleeding interactions between epenthesis, voicing assimilation, and tone lowering. So we had seen that epenthesis bleeds voicing assimilation. That's the case here. Voicing assimilation doesn't apply because it has inserted a vowel in between these two stops with different values for voicing. And we had found that epenthesis counterbleeds tone lowering. Tone lowering is able to apply, even though epenthesis could have removed the conditions for the application of tone lowering. So transitively then, we know that tone lowering has to also precede voicing assimilation. If tone lowering has to precede epenthesis and epenthesis has to precede voicing assimilation, we arrive to this total ordering of the three rules. Let's add into the language the sibilant palatalization rule, assuming the feeding order that we had before, where we had the alternation between the forms mashit and masta of the word for that should read duck in this language. So in this case, we have the same ordering of tone lowering and epenthesis, and we know that the epenthesis rule needed to bleed voicing assimilation and feed palatalization. So the diagram in 13 now tells us that epenthesis has to both precede voicing assimilation and precede palatalization. And since tone lowering must precede epenthesis, since epenthesis counterbleeds tone lowering must occur before all of those rules. What we don't know, however, is the relative ordering of voicing assimilation and palatalization. Those two rules don't interact with one another, and so palatalization could occur before voicing assimilation, or voicing assimilation could occur before palatalization. It simply doesn't matter in what order those two rules occur. So at this point, we can conclude the lecture for today. I think in the exercise, in the Übung for this week, we will look at another case involving tone alternations from Tokyo Japanese. And in the next lecture, we will look at a more detailed morphophonemic analysis from Brazilian Portuguese. Okay, thanks everyone for your attention, and see you again next week.